Gaza, saying more than 500,000 Palestinians are facing catastrophic famine conditions, which include starvation, destitution and death. Now, to help us unpack this, I'm now joined by political analyst Tom Gross. Good evening.
Good evening.
Tom, my first question to you is, famine has now been declared in Gaza. How concerned should we be about this now?
Well, we should be very concerned about the fact this war is still continuing and many people are suffering, and we should hope this war will finish as soon as possible and indeed that Hamas will be removed from power. But we should also be concerned about something else, which is that the UN is meant to be an accurate and reliable organization, and it is not. The same man who made these famine accusations at a press conference a couple of hours ago, he's called Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs, just 3 months ago on May 20th, he told the BBC that 10,000 babies in Gaza would die within 48 hours. It was a completely fabricated claim. It's one of many such claims. He walked it back 10 days later on May 30th this year. So you'd be forgiven for taking with a pinch of salt his highly exaggerated and inaccurate claims, and indeed Israel says they're fabricated. That's not to say we shouldn't be concerned with the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It's very bleak indeed. But at the same time, it's important not to simply make things up, as the UN officials appear to be doing.
Okay, well, we don't actually have anyone from the UN to actually support those claims or to refute them. But what I was going to say in all of this is that Israel's foreign ministry has rejected this particular report, most probably based on what you've just advised. But despite the IPC saying more than 500,000 people are on the strip facing starvation, why do you think that is? Because humanitarian aid, it has been quite hard to get that to the Palestinian people.
Well, there was a period from about March until May when less food was going in because Israel was trying to stop Hamas using the food supplies to sell and booster their money that they use to pay salaries to gunmen and procure more arms and so on. But in the last 2 or 3 months, masses of food have gone in. So, and this is confirmed for sure. So it's very suspicious that the UN should today suddenly declare that there's going to be an imminent famine, especially in Gaza City. I suspect it is an attempt to pressure Israel not to invade or go into Gaza City, as they said they will do in the coming days. So there are two different issues that we should separate. One is it wise for Israel to go into Gaza City, or is it wise to leave Hamas in control there? What is the best for the Palestinians, for Israel and everyone else? A separate issue is whether the UN is being honest in declaring a famine, which is a very serious thing to do. They've only declared 4 famines in the whole world in recent decades. The others were in Sudan and Somalia. They didn't, for example, declare famine in Yemen, where there was definitely a widespread famine, and various other places where there were definitely widespread famine, but they don't seem very interested in it. So it seems a political decision, not a humanitarian decision, by the UN humanitarian chief, because he's trying to pressure Israel to call off its Gaza invasion. Now, as you said in your earlier question, there's huge division here in Israel on whether it's the right thing to do, not just morally, but also tactically, whether this will help Israel win the war and get Hamas out of power and get the Israeli hostages back. And there are divided opinions on this, and there are good arguments for and against.
Yes, and with that information about whether or not humanitarian aid has been stifled or taken by Hamas, that actually hasn't been founded yet. But what I was going to bring up is that the UN chief, Antonio Gutierrez, is calling for unrestricted humanitarian access to Gaza because he's saying that there's a failing of humanity in itself. What do you make of this? Do you feel that not enough humanitarian aid is getting through to those who need it?
No, there are 2 different points. Israel says there's masses of humanitarian aid, but Hamas is taking it and holding it back. And just as it's used some of its own civilians as so-called human shields, in other words, life is cheap for the overall jihadi cause. Remember, Hamas is a member, is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, a self-declared jihadi organization, and they're literally saying that people who die are martyrs and they should be happy to be martyrs because it's for the greater cause of establishing an Islamic State in Gaza. So the one issue is whether there's enough aid going in. Separately with the UN, sorry to be cynical, but the UN is also an organization with a lot of money and a lot of jobs. And the UN have worked hand in hand these past 20 years of Hamas rule in Gaza to basically also, supply themselves with lots of nice fat cat salaries, and they stay in very fancy hotels. It's before the war in Gaza City, and they drive around in nice cars and so on. What they don't want to do is allow this aid to be distributed through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which will give the aid directly to Palestinian civilians rather than through the UN. And the UN, it's a big money-making operation. I know this sounds a bit cynical, and we'd all like to believe the UN is only a force for good. But unfortunately, when one looks at the UN, not just in the Middle East, but at various conflicts in Africa and so on, it's rife with corruption like many other international bodies. And I don't say this lightly. I realize it's a very serious accusation to make, and it's based on years of observation, experience, and so on. I don't make such a serious accusation lightly.
Yes, and Mr. Gross, just on that, obviously we don't have anyone from the UN to kind of push back on that, and obviously to find whether or not your claims are correct. So I understand that, but we're just going to slightly move on. My other question to you was, what does this now mean for Israel's position on the global stage with everyone watching what they're doing? How does Israel look to others?
Well, Israel's suffered reputational damage, particularly in Europe, other democracies like Australia and Canada, less so in the Arab, actually a conference last week with people from throughout the Arab world, and they were saying that they think the Gaza situation gets too much attention, and they were looking at conflicts that have many more fatalities, like in Sudan, which is a partly Arab-speaking country, in Yemen and elsewhere. But certainly in Europe, we see all these pro-Palestinian marches, we see calls for boycotts. One particular shocking incident in Italy 2 days ago, 2 doctors in a hospital near Arezzo filmed themselves destroying 2 medicines made by Teva, which is an Israeli drug company. It's one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies. In other words, they would rather destroy life-saving medicines to make a political point than treat their patients in Italy. I should point out the Italian government and other authorities in Italy are furious, and they may prosecute these doctors criminally. But my question is, the fact that doctors thought it was a good idea to film themselves and put it on social media, destroying medicines they were meant to use to treat their own patients in Italy just to make a political point against the state of Israel, shows just how much anger, hatred, prejudice, whatever you want to call it, against Israel there is. Now, of course, Israel is fighting a war, and Palestinian civilians have died in this war, and there's understandable anxiety and anguish about the situation in Gaza. However, questions in Israel are, there are many wars and conflicts around the world. Why are there no demonstrations, for example, on the streets of London for freeing Tibet? Why does the British Foreign Secretary, for example, not make statements about Uyghur Muslims who are in virtual concentration camp like slave labor camp type conditions in China? And, there are about 130 other conflicts, or there are other peoples of what their own states all around the world. Why does this particular conflict get so much attention? So
Mr. Gross,
some people would say, yes, sorry, please.
Yes, sorry, I want to make sure you get your point across. We don't have that much time left. I just wanted to bring this last question to your attention. Sorry about that. My question is, how hopeful are you that this will, finally come to an end, that there is an end in sight for both Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, either if Israel goes into Gaza City, either Hamas might crumble. It's the last remaining Hamas stronghold, after which there'll be peace, hopefully, and there'll be rebuilding, and there'll be plenty of improvement of the humanitarian situation. So that could happen. or alternatively, things could drag on for a long time. It's very hard to say what outcome will come from the next few days. But this may be an end game to this horrible war that's been going on since October 2023, almost 2 years.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your insight and for joining us this evening. Tom Gross, thank you.
Thank you.